Okinawa, 1st of April through 30th of June, 1945. Planners of United States 10th Army prepared to fight across an island holding approximately 435,000 civilians, a density unmatched in previous Central Pacific assaults. The Japanese 32nd Army had evacuated some residents, but still fought among population centers and cave systems. In the first 9 weeks, United States captions and civil affairs summaries recorded over 60,000 civilians streaming into United States refugee camps from hillside hiding places, a visible contrast to Saipan 9 months earlier, where mass suicides at Marpi Point had followed propaganda warnings of American brutality. The American system, company aidmen, battalion aid stations, collecting and clearing companies, field and evacuation hospitals, was built to sustain divisions, yet it absorbed civilians at scale with triage, plasma, and evacuation chains, while psychological warfare branch teams broadcast surrender instructions guaranteeing humane treatment. The open question, how this medical civil structure actually functioned under fire and how many it saved when expectations were death. Saipan, 15th of June through 9th of July, 1944. An after-action folder shows casualty tables and signal corps photographs from Marpi Point, entries on mass suicides alongside rescue reports for children and wounded civilians who reached marine lines. The cliff faces rose 250 feet above jagged coral. Japanese garrison communications and civilian broadcasts had warned that American forces would torture and execute prisoners. The record from Saipan shows both documented suicides at cliff lines and verified evacuations with medical treatment of non-combatants who survived the fighting or chose to approach American positions. United States Navy and Marine medical detachments appear in unit records. Interpreters and civil affairs officers recorded in period reports worked to coax families from hiding. Some succeeded, many did not. One documented case involved interpreter-assisted surrenders that saved hundreds. Work later associated with Guy Gabaldon in contemporary Marine Corps publications and post-war accounts, but the dominant image remained: families leaping into the sea, convinced that capture meant death. Battalion aid stations provided the forward medical layer. Aidmen carried plasma bottles, morphine syrettes, bandages, and sulfur powder. Plasma and whole blood distribution practices in the Central Pacific had been adjusted from 1943 onward to increase fixed bed capacity in anticipation of longer campaigns. These procedures, designed for soldiers, were applied to civilians encountered during and after the fighting. Litter teams hauled wounded from cliff bases to collection points. Ambulances carried mixed loads. Marines with shrapnel wounds, Okinawan children with dehydration, elderly civilians with fractures, to field hospitals and then to evacuation hospitals on transports offshore. The National Park Service summary states, Banzai Cliff saw the tragic end to the Battle of Saipan. Thousands died. The mixed outcome, suicides recorded alongside successful rescues, created a planning imperative for later operations with large resident populations. Medical capacity alone could not overcome fear. Information had to precede contact. Saipan exposed the requirement for integrated medical civil affairs planning at scale. The question for future operations became, could doctrine, resources, and information operations combine to shift the outcome when civilians faced the moment of surrender? Okinawa's population, approximately 435,000, would multiply the challenge several times over. Central Pacific, 1943 through 1945, Surgeon General memoranda and theater circulars laid out bed ratios, hospital types, and evacuation doctrine for forward operations. Pre-war Army Medical Department doctrine emphasized combatant care with standard evacuation chains. Company aidman to battalion aid station to collecting company to clearing station to field hospital to evacuation hospital to general hospital in rear areas. Each echelon stabilized and transferred patients rearward. Pacific realities, forced expansion, malaria rates in some divisions exceeded 50%, dysentery, dengue, and non-battle injuries from terrain and climate-filled beds. Theater surgeons requested and received authority to expand table of organization hospital capacities in late 1943. The Army Medical Department historical record notes the addition of fixed beds, with a minimum of additional personnel, anticipating surge loads that doctrine had not originally envisioned. Technology defined the system. Company aidmen, trained under Medical Department Military Occupational Specialty 657, carried aid bags with bandages, tourniquets, morphine syrettes in quarter-grain doses, sulfur powder for wound infection, and plasma for shock. Each battalion maintained an aid station with additional supplies, surgical instruments for emergency procedures, and capacity to hold patients for short periods. Collecting companies gathered casualties from multiple battalions, clearing stations triaged and stabilized, field hospitals provided surgical capability, evacuation hospitals offered extended care before transfer to transports or rear area general hospitals with 1,000 beds each. Whole blood and plasma supply chains extended across thousands of miles. Blood collected in the continental United States reached forward units within weeks. Plasma, more stable, moved by air and sea. Refrigerated storage at ports and advanced bases maintained viability. Ambulance jeeps with litter racks replaced horse-drawn carts of earlier wars, cutting evacuation time from hours to minutes in open terrain. Disease control protocols required water, chlorination, latrine placement at specific distances from billets, and vaccination schedules. These measures, designed to keep divisions combat-ready, would later apply to civilian populations in refugee camps. The scalable Army Medical Department evacuation chain became the backbone for civilian triage and treatment once contact occurred. Doctrine had been tested under fire from Tarawa through the Marianas. Okinawa would test whether a system built for divisions could absorb tens of thousands of civilians within weeks. Okinawa, February through March 1945. A 10th Army staff worksheet listed the civilian baseline, approximately 435,000, and assigned tasks: screening, segregation, feeding, treatment, and resettlement. Operation Iceberg planning anticipated combat across terrain, embedded with population centers, fortified villages, and cave systems sheltering both soldiers and civilians. The Japanese 32nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had conducted some civilian evacuations to northern Okinawa and outlying islands, but the majority remained. Ushijima's defensive strategy placed artillery and infantry in fortified positions within and around civilian areas, using the population as camouflage and shield. American planners expected a hostile environment. They also expected refugees, military government, and civil affairs sections integrated with medical elements during the planning phase. Staff officers designated refugee collection points on operational maps. They outlined stockade layouts, sanitation grids, water point placement, ration scales based on caloric requirements, and dispensary locations for medical screening and treatment. Engineers prepared to dig latrines, string wire, and establish chlorination stations. Quartermasters calculated bulk rice and vegetable tonnage to supplement or replace combat rations once civilian inflow exceeded initial estimates. Psychological Warfare Branch, under Commander-in-Chief Pacific Ocean Areas, prepared leaflets and loudspeaker scripts. The information campaign promised humane treatment and outlined procedural steps for surrender: raise hands, wave white cloth, approach slowly, display leaflets if available. Leaflets included serial numbers for tracking distribution and featured simple illustrations, American soldiers offering water and food to Okinawan families. Messages countered Japanese garrison broadcasts that predicted torture, mutilation, and execution upon capture. The planning assumption held that information plus visible medical response could alter civilian behavior at the critical moment of emergence from hiding. United States Naval Institute proceedings, February 1946, recorded the baseline. In 1940, Okinawa Gunto, slightly over 435,000 on Okinawa Island. This figure anchored all logistical and medical planning, pre-planned. Corridors, from cave mouths to collection points to clinics, would determine outcomes once civilians moved. The first test would come at Hagushi beaches on the 1st of April. Within 9 weeks of L-Day, official captions would record over 60,000 civilians in United States camps. Evidence the plan engaged real flows and that the medical civil system functioned under combat conditions. Hagushi beaches and central Okinawa, 1st through 20th of April 1945. Division G1 daily logs recorded the first civilian contacts near assembly areas within 72 hours of the landings. Patrols reported cave whispers, hand signals, and occasional figures at tree lines, indicating non-combatants seeking contact. Command had anticipated limited civilian movement during the opening phase, expecting most residents to remain hidden until major combat passed. Instead, scattered family groups appeared within days, driven by thirst, hunger, or the calculation that American control offered better survival odds than Japanese-held caves. United States Army and Marine formations established refugee collection points as planned. Civil affairs detachments deployed screening teams, interpreters, food distribution, water points, and medical aid stations. The first groups included elderly men, women with infants, and children showing signs of malnutrition and dehydration. Some carried shrapnel wounds from offshore naval bombardment or air strikes. Others showed infected cuts, dysentery, and exhaustion. Battalion aid stations recorded the intake. Aidmen administered plasma for shock, applied sulfur powder to open wounds, distributed water purification tablets, and tagged cases for evacuation. Litter teams hauled those unable to walk. Ambulance jeeps began ferrying mixed streams, soldiers with combat injuries and civilians with trauma or disease, toward clearing stations and field hospitals established inland from the beachhead. The medical chain, designed for military casualties, absorbed civilian patients without segregated facilities. Triage criteria remained consistent: immediate surgical cases first, then delayed cases, then minimal care patients who could wait. Civilians received the same classification. A child with a compound fracture went forward on the same priority as a Marine with a chest wound. Plasma stocks, whole blood supplies, and surgical capacity determined throughput, not the identity of the patient. The National World War II Museum's overview of the campaign places the humanitarian dimension alongside tactical operations, noting that casualties accumulated in both military and civilian populations from the first week. Signal Corps photographers captured images of civilians entering American lines soon after the landings: women in traditional dress, children barefoot, men carrying improvised white flags or leaflets. These images appeared in official captions weeks later, confirming that early contact occurred as planned. Early accommodation prevented civilian recirculation into combat zones and established predictable routes to care. Refugees processed at collection points moved rearward to temporary camps, reducing the risk of infiltration and allowing civil affairs teams to screen for military-age males and gather intelligence on Japanese dispositions. Medical treatment at the point of contact reinforced the promise embedded in leaflets: surrender would not mean death. By the 2nd of June, 1945, one museum caption stated, "Over 60,000 civilians streamed into United States refugee camps." The number reflected 9 weeks of continuous intake, a flow that began with the first cautious approaches in early April. Okinawa, April through May 1945. A leaflet proof from Commander-in-Chief Pacific Ocean Areas and the Office of War Information promised humane treatment and outlined surrender gestures for civilians. The leaflet measured approximately 5 inches by 8 inches, printed on lightweight paper suitable for airdrop, artillery shell dispersion, or hand distribution by patrols. Serial numbers tracked production batches. Illustrations showed American soldiers offering food and water to Okinawan families. Text, vetted by Nisei linguists, used simple phrasing: approach with hands raised, wave white cloth, display this leaflet. Japanese wartime propaganda had stressed United States atrocities throughout the Pacific. Garrison commanders on Okinawa reinforced these messages, warning civilians that capture meant torture, rape, and execution. Leaflets and loudspeakers countered with specific, verifiable instructions and guarantees. The psychological warfare branch distributed millions of leaflets via aircraft drop, artillery shell canisters, and ground teams. Tank-mounted loudspeakers and landing craft infantry fitted with amplification equipment broadcast surrender instructions in Okinawan dialect. Scripts repeated key phrases: safe passage guaranteed, medical care provided, families kept together, food and water available. Broadcasts operated during lulls in fighting, timed to reach cave systems where civilians sheltered. Linguists adjusted phrasing based on dialect variation across the island, ensuring comprehension in rural areas where standard Japanese might not penetrate. A Central Intelligence Agency reading room summary from June 1945 documents the effect: civilians approaching American lines, the majority waving SIN-CPOA surrender leaflets, which guaranteed them humane treatment upon surrender. The leaflet became a non-verbal signal, an improvised identification friend or foe mechanism that reduced risk at the moment of emergence. Soldiers recognized the leaflet and held fire. Civilians understood the leaflet as a protective talisman, a tangible link to the promised broadcast over loudspeakers. Post-battle good treatment leaflets, preserved in collections such as those at Washington County Heritage, show Americans assisting Okinawans with medical care, food distribution, and child evacuation. These images, produced during the campaign, reinforced the message to civilians still in hiding. The propaganda about American brutality was false. The information environment reduced risk at the point of contact. A family exiting a cave with a leaflet held overhead faced lower probability of misidentification than one emerging without a signal. Leaflets served as battlefield communication in an environment where verbal exchange was impossible under fire and visual identification difficult in vegetation and broken terrain. As weather deteriorated and combat intensified through May, leaflet-assisted surrenders continued. The persistence of the behavior, civilians emerging with leaflets despite increased artillery and small arms fire, provided evidence that information had overcome fear sufficiently to prompt movement toward American lines. The system worked not because propaganda convinced civilians to trust unconditionally, but because the first groups to surrender received the treatment promised, creating a feedback loop visible to those still hiding. Central and southern Okinawa, April through May 1945. A company aidman's log recorded plasma units issued, sulfur powder applied, and litters dispatched. The log, maintained in pencil on water-resistant paper, included notations of civilians alongside soldier cases: elderly male, shrapnel abdomen, plasma X2, evac priority, child approx 4 hours, dehydration, oral fluids, walking wounded. The evacuation chain, designed for divisional casualties, now faced mixed military-civilian throughput without proportional expansion of personnel. Aidmen operated forward with rifle companies. Each carried an aid bag containing battle dressings, tourniquets, morphine syrettes in quarter-grain doses for pain management, sulfur powder for wound infection, plasma bottles with tubing and needles, water purification tablets, and medical tags for triage classification. The aid bag weighed approximately 20 pounds fully loaded. Aidmen worked without weapons, marking themselves with brassards, displaying the Geneva Convention Red Cross on white background. Battalion aid stations provided the next echelon. Station personnel included medical officers, enlisted aidmen, and litter bearers. Stations held supplies for emergency surgery, scalpels, clamps, sutures, additional plasma, and whole blood when available, splints, and larger quantities of bandages and antiseptics. Aid stations occupied protected positions behind the forward line, often in captured buildings, caves, or tents with camouflage. Patients arrived on litters carried by 4-man teams or aboard ambulance jeeps fitted with racks for 3 litters per vehicle. Collecting companies gathered casualties from multiple battalions, providing triage and short-term holding. Clearing stations, located farther rearward, performed more complex stabilization and determined evacuation priorities. Field hospitals offered full surgical capability with operating tents, sterilization equipment, recovery wards, and capacity to hold patients for days if necessary. Evacuation hospitals provided extended care before transfer to transports or rear-area general hospitals. Whole blood and plasma moved forward through the chain. Blood arrived in refrigerated containers via air and sea from collection centers in the continental United States. Plasma, freeze-dried and reconstituted at the point of use, offered longer shelf life and simpler storage. Distribution tracked unit locations, anticipated casualty rates, and resupply intervals. Medical logistics officers calculated usage based on campaign intensity, allocating stocks to maintain forward availability. Civilians entered this system at every echelon. Aidmen at cave mouths treated Okinawan children for malnutrition. Battalion aid stations stabilized elderly civilians with traumatic injuries. Field hospitals performed surgery on women wounded by artillery fragments. Evacuation hospitals admitted mixed wards. Marines recovering from amputations in beds adjacent to Okinawan farmers treated for dysentery and infected wounds. The Army Medical Department narrative on fixed-bed expansion and evacuation doctrine describes systems adapted across the Central Pacific to handle surge loads with minimum additional personnel. Okinawa proved the doctrine's elasticity. The medical chain absorbed non-combatants, stabilized them using the same protocols and equipment designed for soldiers, and transferred them rearward to camp dispensaries once immediate treatment concluded. By late May, camp dispensaries reported pediatric malnutrition clusters, measles outbreaks, and dysentery cases requiring public health countermeasures beyond individual treatment. The medical mission expanded from acute trauma care to population health management. Rear areas north of the Shuri Line, May through June 1945. A civil affairs map overlay marked stockades, latrine lines, chlorinated water points, dispensaries, and ration issue stations. Temporary pens expected at battalion scale became town-sized camps, with thousands in queue awaiting resettlement. The camps occupied valleys and coastal flats secured in the opening phase of the campaign, areas outside artillery range where engineers could establish infrastructure. Engineers dug latrine trenches at ratios specified in Army field sanitation manuals. 1 latrine seat per 30 occupants. Trenches placed minimum 150 feet from water sources and food preparation areas. Lime distributed daily reduced odor and insect attraction. Water points drew from wells or streams, with engineer core chlorination units treating capacity measured in gallons per day. Chlorine concentrations followed public health standards, sufficient to kill pathogens without causing illness. Water cans marked potable, distinguished treated supplies. From untreated sources, ration scales adapted as camps grew. Initial issues used C rations and K rations from combat stocks, substituting military meals for civilian diets. As tonnage arrived and kitchens established, bulk rice, vegetables, canned fish, and salt replaced individual ration packets. Calories calculated per capita per day ensured minimum nutrition. Camp administrators tracked weight gain in children as an indicator of dietary adequacy. Dispensaries operated daily sick call. Medical officers and aidmen treated minor injuries, distributed medications, monitored infectious disease, and referred serious cases to field hospitals. Vaccination programs targeted diphtheria, tetanus, and typhoid, diseases endemic in wartime conditions with disrupted sanitation. Vaccination records tracked coverage rates to prevent outbreaks. Camp population tallies forwarded to theater surgeons provided data for medical supply allocation. Weekly reports listed total residents, new arrivals, transfers to resettlement areas, births, and deaths. Morbidity reports broke down cases by diagnosis, respiratory infection, gastrointestinal illness, trauma, malnutrition. Epidemiologists analyzed trends, identifying clusters that required intervention, latrines relocated, water sources retested, ration supplements issued, sanitation and nutrition lowered morbidity and allowed orderly screening for security purposes. Civil affairs teams interviewed military-age males, cross-referencing statements against intelligence on Japanese unit dispositions. Screenings separated combatants from non-combatants, genuine refugees from potential infiltrators. The process required interpreters, patience, and time, resources available only because camps provided stable environments. Administrative routines emerged, schools opened for children, using improvised classrooms and Okinawan teachers identified among camp residents. Labor rosters assigned adults to camp maintenance, cooking, sanitation, construction. Work provided structure and allowed residents to contribute rather than remain passive recipients. These routines foreshadowed early occupation procedures, administrative frameworks tested under combat conditions and later applied across Japan. The contrast between initial expectations and operational reality defined the challenge. Planners envisioned thousands, camps handled tens of thousands. Ration and medical supply adapted accordingly, with logistics officers requisitioning bulk tonnage and medical stocks to match actual throughput rather than planning estimates. The system scaled because doctrine allowed flexibility and because supply lines from rear bases could deliver tonnage measured in thousands of tons per week. By late June, camps north of the Shuri line held populations exceeding many Okinawan villages, temporary cities administered by military government detachments and sustained by medical logistical chains originally designed to support combat divisions. Okinawa, April through June 1945. End of June casualty boards recorded approximately 12,000 United States dead, from total casualties near 49,000, 70,000 to 110,000 Japanese military dead, depending on source, and civilian deaths estimated between 100,000 and 150,000. The campaign lasted approximately 82 days, from the 1st of April through organized resistance ending near the 21st of June, with mopping up operations continuing into July. Command aimed to separate civilians from combat zones and reduce collateral losses through refugee camps and medical care. The southern fighting, monsoon conditions, and cave warfare produced mass mortality that planning could not avert. Terrain shaped outcomes. The Shuri Line, a network of fortified ridges and tunnels across southern Okinawa, anchored Japanese defensive positions. Artillery concentrated on reverse slopes covered approaches. Caves sheltered troops and civilians together, making target identification impossible from the air or at distance. Monsoon rains beginning in May disrupted evacuation. Ambulance jeeps bogged in mud, airstrips flooded, grounding medical evacuation flights. Field hospitals erected tents on saturated ground, fighting mud infiltration in surgical wards. Supplies arrived late or damaged. The weather multiplied casualties by complicating treatment and evacuation, extending the time wounded spent exposed to the elements. Artillery concentrations in the Kian Peninsula during the final phase increased lethal radius in areas where civilians and soldiers sheltered in proximity. Cave demolitions necessary to reduce fortified positions, complicated rescue efforts. Engineers used satchel charges and flamethrowers to neutralize caves assessed as military strongpoints. Some caves held only civilians, others held mixed populations. Distinguishing required close inspection, often under fire, with limited time for assessment. Japanese 32nd Army doctrine prioritized defense to the last man, prolonging combat and civilian exposure. Lieutenant General Ushijima issued orders for suicide attacks and rejected proposals for organized withdrawal or surrender. His defensive strategy maximized American casualties, but ensured maximum civilian casualties as well. with population centers and fortified zones overlapping. Casualty estimates vary across reputable sources. The National World War II Museum synthesizes multiple figures, noting range variance between United States military records, Japanese records, and Okinawan civilian accounts. Discrepancies reflect incomplete documentation, bodies lost in caves or at sea, and differing definitions of combatant versus non-combatant in an environment where lines blurred. Despite planned camps and medical infrastructure, terrain, weather, and the defenders' doctrine overwhelmed mitigation efforts. Every civilian processed into a camp represented a life saved, but the number saved remained a fraction of the population exposed. Medical throughput and camp intake represent quantifiable outcomes. Over 60,000 admitted, treated, and sheltered in 9 weeks. The number dead represents the larger tragedy, a cost measured against the strategic necessity of the campaign and the choices made by commands on both sides. As Shuri fell in late May and forces pivoted south toward the Kian Peninsula, civilian emergence accelerated. Organized resistance fragmenting meant fewer troops enforcing Japanese orders to remain in place. Families calculated odds and moved toward American lines, many waving surrender leaflets as they approached. Kian Peninsula, 20th through 30th of June, 1945. A psychological warfare branch field summary noted groups approaching United States lines holding leaflets aloft, waving white cloth, and calling out in Okinawan dialect. Command had anticipated isolated holdouts as organized resistance collapsed. Instead, thousands left caves as the Japanese 32nd Army fragmented, command structure dissolved, and soldiers died at their positions, or committed suicide rather than surrender. Infantry outposts processed families and wounded civilians. Aidmen conducted immediate triage, checking pulses, assessing breathing, identifying bleeding or fractures. Civil affairs teams separated prisoners of war from non-combatants using interpreters to conduct initial screening. Military-age males received closer scrutiny. Families with children, elderly civilians, and women moved quickly through the process toward collection points and medical stations. The Air University's 2024 analysis of the campaign characterizes the late June civilian flows as a direct result of collapsing Japanese control and the visible success of earlier surrenders. Civilians who had observed the treatment of those who surrendered in April and May made calculations based on evidence rather than propaganda. The feedback loop, leaflet distribution, visible medical response, successful integration into camps, created conditions for mass emergence once military pressure removed the threat of Japanese enforcement. The Central Intelligence Agency summary from June 1945 describes the phenomenon in real time. The majority waving Cinque surrender leaflets, which guaranteed them humane treatment upon surrender. The leaflet, a piece of printed paper, functioned as a passport in an environment where identity and intent determined survival. Soldiers recognized the object and its meaning. Civilians understood it as proof they had received and believed the promise. Medical response at the point of contact reinforced the information campaign. Each group that emerged, received treatment, and moved rearward to camps became evidence for those still hiding. Word spread through cave systems. Americans provide water, food, medical care. Families do not disappear. Children receive treatment. The promise is real. The system worked because visibility mattered. Refugees processed in daylight in view of other civilians created observable outcomes. Medical treatment occurred at forward positions where civilians in adjacent caves could see plasma bottles, bandages, litter teams. The evacuation chain moved people rearward visibly, reducing fear that surrender meant execution out of sight. By late June, compiled captions cited over 60,000 in camps. The National World War II Museum's documentation, using Signal Corps photographs and official captions dated 2nd of June 1945, provides the baseline figure. Late June flows pushed camp administration to logistical limits. Engineers expanded stockade perimeters. Quartermasters expedited bulk ration shipments. Medical officers requisitioned additional vaccine stocks and anti-malarial supplies. The system absorbed the surge because doctrine permitted flexibility and because rear area bases could deliver tonnage on compressed timelines. The southern pocket breaking released civilians who had remained under Japanese control through 2 months of combat. Their emergence, concentrated in days rather than weeks, tested every element of the medical civil system simultaneously: screening, triage, treatment, feeding, sanitation, and resettlement. Comparative frame: Saipan, June through July, 1944, versus Okinawa, April through June, 1945. 2 caption sheets placed side by side show the difference. Marpi Point, cliff faces, bodies on rocks below, families leaping rather than surrender. Okinawa, intake lines, children receiving water, medics treating wounds, tents organized in rows. In 1944, propaganda and fear produced mass civilian suicide. Japanese garrison commanders on Saipan warned that Americans tortured prisoners, raped women, and murdered children. Civilians believed the warnings. Thousands died at Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff rather than face capture. United States Marines and interpreters attempted rescues, shouting assurances, displaying white flags, approaching slowly to demonstrate peaceful intent. Some families accepted help, many refused. The cliffs provided a visible final choice. The choice reflected what civilians believed awaited them if they surrendered. In 1945, psychological warfare branch operations, pre-planned camps, and scalable medical capacity yielded mass surrender and treatment instead. Leaflet series numbered in the millions, distributed across Okinawa before and during combat. Loudspeaker scripts broadcast daily. Time to reach cave systems during lulls. The messages countered Japanese propaganda with specific promises: approach safely, medical care provided, families kept together, food and water available. The mechanisms differed fundamentally. Saipan lacked systematic information operations, leaflet drops occurred, but without integrated loudspeaker support or sustained messaging. Medical capacity existed, but without pre-planned refugee camps or civil affairs detachments tasked explicitly with civilian intake. The Saipan experience taught that medical care alone could not overcome fear if information did not precede contact. Okinawa planning integrated lessons from Saipan. Fixed bed expansions documented by the Army Medical Department allowed surge absorption. Evacuation hospitals admitted civilians without segregated facilities, using the same surgical teams and plasma stocks allocated for military casualties. Camp dispensaries with daily sick call provided ongoing care beyond acute trauma stabilization. Chlorinated water, latrine standards, ration scales, and vaccination programs addressed public health threats that killed as reliably as combat. The documented throughput provides the quantitative measure. United States Naval Institute proceedings and National World War II Museum sources established the population baseline, 435,000 civilians on Okinawa, and the camp intake figure, over 60,000 by early June. The number represents 15% of the baseline population processed through American medical civil systems in 9 weeks, a rate impossible without pre-planned infrastructure and scalable doctrine. Doctrinal learning from 1944 operations produced procedural readiness for Okinawa's civilian dimension. The key indicator is not anecdote, but throughput. How many civilians entered American lines, were screened, treated, and resettled in weeks rather than months. The system handled scale because planning anticipated scale and because logistics could deliver tonnage to match. The contrast, Saipan suicides versus Okinawa camp intake, illustrates what changed between campaigns. Propaganda met organized counter-messaging. Fear met visible medical response. Death became one option among alternatives rather than the only perceived outcome. The numbers recorded in official captions document the difference. Rear areas and camps, June through July, 1945. A civil affairs ledger listed camp populations by week, ration tonnage delivered, and clinic visits recorded. Initial estimates envisioned thousands processed over months. In practice, the system handled tens of thousands in weeks, with ration and medical supply adapted continuously to match actual throughput rather than planning projections. The population baseline, approximately 435,000 civilians on Okinawa, came from United States Naval Institute proceedings, February 1946, citing pre-war Japanese census figures adjusted for wartime evacuation. The camp intake figure, over 60,000 by early June, appeared in National World War II Museum captions using Signal Corps photographs and official documentation. The proportion represents measurable engagement, 15% of the baseline population entering American custody within 9 weeks of the 1st of April landings. Fixed bed capacities per Army Medical Department tables provided the infrastructure, field hospitals with surgical capability, evacuation hospitals with extended care wards, and general hospitals in rear areas offered total capacity measured in thousands of beds across the theater. Okinawa allocated a portion to civilian intake without expanding personnel proportionally, relying instead on elastic doctrine that permitted mixed military-civilian throughput. Blood and plasma distribution tracked unit locations and anticipated usage. Medical logistics officers calculated requirements based on combat intensity, historical casualty rates, and resupply intervals. Okinawa's extended duration and high casualties required continuous replenishment. Plasma, with longer shelf life, moved forward in larger quantities. Whole blood, requiring refrigeration, moved via priority air and sea transport, arriving in refrigerated containers and distributed to forward hospitals within days of collection in the continental United States. Ration tonnage, converted to calorie equivalents, determine nutritional adequacy. Initial C ration and K ration substitution provided approximately 3,000 calories per day per person, exceeding minimum requirements but depleting combat stocks. Bulk rice, vegetables, canned protein, and salt reduced per capita cost and matched Okinawan dietary patterns. Tonnage calculations multiplied daily per capita ration weight by camp population, yielding weekly and monthly shipping requirements forwarded to theater quartermasters. Quantifiables define success: 435,000 baseline population, over 60,000 admitted to camps, fixed bed hospital capacities in the thousands, plasma and whole blood measured in units per day, ration tonnage in tons per week. The measurable medical civil throughput contradicts the propaganda premise that surrender meant death and explains how large populations could surrender and survive in an environment designed to produce maximum lethality. The same methods and personnel pipelines fed directly into early occupation health administration weeks later. Military government detachments transitioned from managing refugee camps to administering Okinawan civilian government. Dispensaries became permanent clinics. Ration distribution evolved into supervised local agriculture and trade resumption. Sanitation standards set in camps applied to village reconstruction. The procedural frameworks tested under combat conditions became templates for post-surrender administration across Japan. Medical-civil integration at Okinawa represented doctrine under maximum stress, proving scalability when expectations met reality at Division Army level across 82 days of sustained combat. Okinawa, July through August 1945. A military government circular set water standards, vaccination schedules, ration issues, and labor assignments for camp residents awaiting return to villages. What began as ad hoc reception evolved into systematic administration: sanitation grids, dispensaries operating daily sick call, schools for children, and work details for adults. The transformation reflected operational requirements. Camps, holding thousands for weeks, required structure beyond emergency triage. Engineers maintained infrastructure. Latrine trenches required daily lime application and periodic relocation as capacity filled. Water points needed constant monitoring. Chlorine concentrations tested multiple times daily, sources inspected for contamination, distribution cans cleaned and refilled on schedule. Generators powered lighting for night operations and refrigeration for medical supplies. Road networks within camps allowed ambulance and supply vehicle movement. Dispensaries expanded beyond trauma care to preventive medicine. Vaccination programs achieved near-total coverage for diphtheria, tetanus, and typhoid within weeks. Medical officers tracked immunization rates, identifying holdouts, and conducting follow-up campaigns. Epidemic disease surveillance monitored respiratory illness, gastrointestinal infection, and vector-borne disease. Morbidity reports triggered interventions, additional latrines, ration supplements for malnourished children, quarantine for infectious cases. Schools occupied tents or salvaged buildings. Okinawan teachers identified among camp residents conducted classes using improvised materials, slate boards, chalk, textbooks, salvaged from damaged schools or printed by military government. Curriculum emphasized basic literacy and numeracy, with instruction in Okinawan dialect and Japanese. Children received priority ration supplements, milk powder, canned fruit, vitamin concentrates, to address malnutrition documented on intake. Labor rosters assigned adults to camp maintenance, reducing dependence on American personnel and providing structure. Civilians cooked bulk rations, distributed water, maintained latrines, constructed additional housing, and staffed dispensaries under medical officer supervision. Work assignments rotated to distribute burden equitably. Payment came in ration priority or small cash allowances once military government established scrip systems. Resettlement planning began in June. Civil affairs teams assessed village damage, agricultural viability, and security conditions in cleared areas. Families returned in organized groups, transported by truck convoy with initial ration supplies and agricultural implements. Engineers cleared mines and unexploded ordnance from fields and roads. Military government detachments remained in villages during transition, monitoring sanitation, and providing medical backup until local capacity resumed. Military medicine documentation and National Library of Medicine hosted materials describe camp public health practices and transition to local administration as standard occupation procedures tested under combat conditions. The Okinawa experience demonstrated that military, medical, and civil systems could stabilize large populations, reduce morbidity, and create administrative frameworks for governance, all under fire and within weeks rather than months. The Okinawa template influenced post-surrender public health procedures across Japan. Medical officers who managed camp dispensaries later staffed occupation health departments. Sanitation standards applied in refugee camps became requirements for Japanese municipalities. Vaccination protocols developed for Okinawan civilians extended to Japanese urban populations. Ration distribution methods scaled to feed millions in the home islands during the transition from wartime to occupation economy. National Defense University Press describes joint evacuation architecture, Army, Navy, and air assets coordinating patient movement that continued post-battle, consolidating wounded and sick to rear facilities and eventually to the continental United States. The system, stressed to capacity during combat, proved robust enough to sustain operations through transition and occupation phases. Comparative summary, 1944 through 1945. A final display board contrasted two campaigns separated by 9 months and doctrine learned under fire. On the left, Saipan, Marpi Point, cliff faces, bodies below. On the right, Okinawa, intake lines, medics treating civilians, camp populations in the tens of thousands, children receiving water and medical care. Propaganda predicted certain death upon capture. Japanese garrison communications and civilian broadcasts on both islands warned that Americans tortured prisoners, executed civilians, and committed atrocities. The warnings shaped behavior. On Saipan, thousands chose death over surrender, convinced capture meant worse. Families leaped together, preferring control over their final moments to the unknown terror they believed awaited below. Archival leaflets, captions, and casualty frameworks from Okinawa record different outcomes. Leaflet serial numbers tracked distribution in the millions. Illustrations showed Americans offering aid. Text promised humane treatment, specified approach procedures, and guaranteed medical care and family unity. Loudspeaker broadcasts repeated the promises daily, using Okinawan dialect to maximize comprehension. The information campaign saturated the battle space before and during combat. Medical throughput provided observable proof. Company aidmen treated civilians at cave mouths. Battalion aid stations stabilized mixed military-civilian casualties. Field hospitals performed surgery without segregation. Plasma, whole blood, surgical teams allocated by medical need rather than identity. Evacuation hospitals admitted Okinawan patients alongside American soldiers using the same wards, equipment, and personnel. Camp dispensaries continued care beyond acute trauma, addressing malnutrition, infectious disease, and chronic conditions. The Central Intelligence Agency PSYOP summary from June 1945 documents the result in real time, the majority waving SIN CPOA surrender leaflets, which guaranteed them humane treatment upon surrender. The leaflet, physical evidence of the promise, functioned as communication when verbal exchange was impossible and as identification when distinguishing intent under fire proved difficult. Civilians displayed leaflets. Soldiers recognized them. The system worked because information preceded contact and because visible response validated the promise. Strategic results emerged from integration. Information operations plus Army Medical Department scalability shaped outcomes in the Pacific's costliest battle, even amid catastrophic loss. Approximately 12,000 American dead, 70,000 to 110,000 Japanese military dead, 100,000 to 150,000 civilian dead across 82 days of combat. The losses exceeded any previous Pacific campaign. Within that context, over 60,000 civilians processed into American camps represented measurable survival. Lives saved by systems designed, resourced, and executed under fire. The numbers replace rumors. Population baseline approximately 435,000 from United States Naval Institute proceedings. Camp intake over 60,000 from National World War II Museum official captions. Fixed bed hospital capacity in the thousands from Army Medical Department tables. Plasma and whole blood measured in daily units. Ration tonnage in tons per week. Vaccination coverage approaching 100% in camps. Morbidity rates tracked and addressed. Resettlement organized and executed. Administrative frameworks established. Closing fact: 435,000 civilians on Okinawa at campaign start. Over 60,000 processed through American medical civil systems, in 9 weeks. The proportion, 15%, represents what doctrine, resources, information operations, and execution under fire could achieve when planning met reality and when promises made by leaflet found validation in treatment rendered at the cave mouths, battalion aid stations, field hospitals, and refugee camps across the island. They crawled out of caves expecting death. American medics were waiting, population baseline, United States Naval Institute proceedings, February 1946. Okinawa Gunto, slightly over 435,000 on Okinawa Island. Camp intake caption, WWW2 online, National World War II Museum. Over 60,000 civilians streamed into United States refugee camps. PSYOP leaflet effect. Central Intelligence Agency Reading Room, Summary of Psychological Warfare Activities, Okinawa, June 1945. Medical Doctrine and Fixed Bed Capacity, United States Army Center of Military History Medical Service in the War Against Japan, Saipan Mass Suicides Context, National Park Service pages and reference articles on Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff at Marpi Point, Casualty Ranges and 82-Day Campaign, National World War II Museum Syntheses, Evacuation Architecture Post-Battle, National Defense University Press 2025, Comparative End of Hostilities Marker, Air University 2024, Conclusion of Major Combat 2nd of July 1945. If you value fact-based military history grounded in archival sources and numbers, consider supporting the channel. This documentary narrative presents the Battle of Okinawa's civilian dimension through verified archival sources, official statistics, and documented military procedures. Every figure, from the 435,000 baseline population to the over 60,000 admitted to camps, comes from period records, United States Naval Institute publications, Army Medical Department histories, Central Intelligence Agency, PSYOP summaries, and National World War II Museum documentation. The story respects the magnitude of loss, approximately 100,000 to 150,000 civilian deaths, while documenting the systems that saved measurable numbers when doctrine, information operations, and medical capacity combined under fire. The narrative maintains a documentary tone throughout, using technical details, plasma administration, battalion aid stations, leaflet serial numbers, chlorination standards, to ground abstract planning in physical reality. The contrast between Saipan's cliff-face suicides and Okinawa's organized camp intake illustrates doctrinal evolution between 1944 and 1945, showing how military organizations learn and adapt under the pressure of total war.